Welcome, specimens. Today is Thursday and we are, surprisingly, taking a break from what we have gone over the past 3 days, which was going over all the different classes and specs, possible best combination of legendaries to use in 9.2. We went over the melee DPS, the tanks and the healers. Only the range DPS is left. But instead, what we do today is checking up on how the situation has been progressing and changing in the raid, because it's been over a week, 10 days exactly since the last time we checked on this, and we wanted to take another recap before we moved on with other things. One of the important parts that we went over since we started this patch 9.1.5 was trying to figure out just how important, just how beneficial it would have been for players to be able to freely move around covenants. Is this, this is something that players asked a lot of times. It's something that they said it would have essentially made them, for example, play the game more, engage in the content more, because they would have rather wanted to play different covenants for different activities. Not being able to do so made them feel bad, made them feel underpowered sometimes. So now that we have a patch that allows you to do all of this, we could have seen some changes, some shifts in the popularity of certain covenants, and now we have gone through 3 resets of this patch. There has been plenty of time now to see just how many of these classes and specs have moved from one covenant to another. Perhaps they are splitting time between the covenants based on the activity. So that was something we spent quite a bit of time analyzing the first time we started making these raid recaps for 9.1.5. Now, before we get into that, we're gonna quickly blitz past the boring part of the video, because at this point there aren't too many changes on this side, which is the changes in popularity, the changes in population of classes and specs that have been playing the raid. If you look, basically since the start of this patch, the difference that we have gotten from then to now, not really much of anything has changed. The only one we were keeping track of particularly was the rise of Frost, which over the course of 3 weeks has actually gone back up to match Fire. The reason for this, for those who forgot or simply did not care, is that Frost's single target damage was buffed in the patch. So more mage players were willing to go back and try Frost again. So at this point they have now matched, and they are fighting a fierce battle with Fire to be the more popular mage spec in raids. Many of the other specs have been remaining more or less where they were before. We do still continue to have a slow decline of Unholy Decay, which has been losing a few more spots here and there, as well as Frost Decay, perhaps as a result increasing a little bit, but most of the other specs have not changed too much. We do see the other one, which we also pointed out, but it's not that relevant given the situation, is that Fury Warrior. Compared to when we started this patch, Fury has gained way more representation over time, and this is what perhaps also caused Arms Warrior to lose out their top 2 spot to Beast Mastery Hunter as of today. And also, of course, another thing we were keeping track of for a long time was the fact that Beast Mastery had matched and then passed and then very greatly surpassed Marksmanship Hunter in terms of popularity when it comes to raids. Now, I realize I said we were going to go through this quickly, so let's be quick. The other thing we talked about was the popularity of healers. 10 days ago we mentioned, surprisingly, that for the first time Holy Paladin surpassed Restoration Shaman in terms of popularity. Yeah, as also suggested, that was probably a 1-week thing. Restoration Shaman is back up again to be the more popular of healers. Lastly, we have the tanks, which we can just skip past because nothing really moved significantly compared to the last time we looked over this. Brewmaster and Blood are still very tied to each other. Vengeance has slipped in 3rd place, still pretty comfortable there, not really facing any assaults from Protection Paladin. So this seems to be the situation for the popularity in the raid. The other thing related strictly to what we usually check first in this type of videos is basically the DPS, the performance of the DPS in the patch, which is also why I said we should move past this quickly, because there isn't too many changes. I have already tired you to death pointing out that the top 10 DPS performers are taken up by 8 melee DPS, and this has continued to be so. You only have Balanced Druid and barely, just barely, Demonology Warlock in the top 10. The rest is populated by melee DPS. Over the course of 3 weeks of this patch, not really anything changed drastically. The bottom DPS are more or less still the same. The ones sort of floating in the middle, Arcane, Fire, Elemental, Ret, are still there, just chilling. So we also didn't have any major movement in terms of the current performance of the DPS. So if we're not talking too much about the popularity and we're not talking too much about the DPS performers, then what are we talking about today? Well, you know, there was another thing we were looking over since this patch started, which was the change in Covenant options, in Covenant usage of all of the specs. So the first in line, because it also had the least amount of drastic changes, were the healers. Ever since the patch launched, are we going to see healers being able to free themselves from their shackles and start to play what they want? Not the case really for Discipline, not the case for Holy Paladin either, and not really the case for Restoration Druid, because those three classes for healers were just stuck playing one of their covenants because it was so key and crucial to their build. So Kyrian for Discipline, Nightfae for Restoration Druid, and Venthyr for Holy Paladin. So those were about as known as anything else, that they would have remained more or less the same. The one that changed a little bit more over the last 3 weeks have been Holy Priest, which can now play a little bit of everything, really. Just look at that shit. And then you have Shaman and Monk. Shaman, as predicted, has more and more split its time between Necrolord for raiding and Kyrian for Mythic Plus. The other major change, the only major change out of all of the healers, is Mistweaver Monk. We just went over the healers and their popular double legendary options, and we put Mistweaver at the top. One of the reasons for this was their Covenant legendary, which is what they are using currently. You know, when monks did not have the option and the chance to freely move around the covenants up to 3 weeks ago before this patch, they weren't really going Venthyr too much. Venthyr was the better competitive option, but it had always been a pretty niche and hipster pick for monks. It was also not played whatsoever for Brewmaster and Windwalker, so if you wanted to multi-spec, it was the significantly worse choice. You could have gone Necrolord or Kyrian and played all three specs decently if you wanted to, so Venthyr wasn't really that picked anyways, even if it showed to be the more performing one. Now that you can, however, now that you can freely swap covenants, more and more Mistweaver monks have been convinced essentially that it's time to move over to Venthyr. So we have seen over the last 3 weeks some 20+% move of Mistweaver monks going Venthyr. Then after the healers we have the tanks. So as far as tanks are concerned, there are also in here 3 specs that haven't really went changing too much because of the power of their Covenant ability. One is Guardian Druid, which is predominantly Nightfae. Then you have Protection Warrior, which has been predominantly staying Kyrian, and then you have Vengeance Demon Hunter, which has been also predominantly Kyrian. So when you go and look at the ability of these tank specs to play whatever they want in 9.1.5, we do see, for example, Protection Paladin being able to split their time better between Kyrian for Mythic Plus and Venthyr for raid encounters. Brewmaster Monks, again, because of their consistent passive damage that their Necrolord Covenant can give them in Mythic Plus, are also moving more towards Necrolord in Mythic Plus. And lastly, you have Death Knights. Death Knights who were staying primarily Venthyr in Mythic Plus, and they have been so even now. The main change is in raid encounters, where Necrolord has lost quite a bit in favor, in significant favor of Kyrian. Kyrian is a pretty defensive option in raid encounters. It allows you to have some pretty nice passive background reduced damage with Shackle the Undead, so that's probably why for raid encounters single target reduced damage is just better, more solid defensive choice for DKs. It's not that they can go for more damage in raid encounters because they don't have any, so might as well be more defensive. Lastly, finally, we get to see some DPS. The melee DPS had the more variety compared to the range DPS. They were more zapping around between all the different covenants, so that's cool. So maybe now that we have this patch that allows them to freely roam amongst these covenants, we're going to be able to see more changes. Arms Warriors have remained mostly the same in Mythic Plus, but they have been convinced to move more towards Nightfae in raid encounters. You have specs that haven't really changed that much, like Assassination, because of their split between Necrolord and Venthyr remaining mostly the same up to now. Same goes for Enhancement, which was Venthyr for Mythic Plus and Nightfae for raid encounters, and of course Feral Druid. permanently stuck as a Night Fae. We do have more changes for Frost DKs. They are ditching, in general, Necrolord a little bit more. They are ditching it more in Red Encounters as well as in Mythic Plus. They are playing it less. They are favoring Kyrian a little bit more as well. Same can be said for Fury Warriors, who have been moving a little bit more towards Night Fae when it comes to Mythic Plus, because of the good Ancient Aftershock they can use, as well as usual, always worth mentioning, Mythic Plus and Night Fae Soulbinds are the best possible combination you can have, regardless of what DPS you're playing. Meanwhile, in Red Encounters, being Night Fae is not as important, so we can see Fury Warriors moving significantly. Basically half of the Fury Warriors that used to be Night Fae and used to be Ventir just moved over Kyrian for Red Encounters. Another similar, perhaps not as much, change you see in Havoc Demon Hunters. Havoc were primarily Night Fae. But then you also have the fact that Ventir has become a pretty solid single target option in Red Encounters, so now that they can alternate, we see a whooping, a massive growth from 2% of Havoc Demon Hunters being Ventir to 47% of Havoc Demon Hunters being Ventir. This is pretty much the poster child of what you would want to happen in a patch like this one. There are not too many other significant changes for melee DPS. We can also mention Survival. Finally, one of my campaigns, one of my crusades is turning through. Survival moving more towards Ventir because of the single target damage and buff they can gain in Red Encounters, as opposed to Kyrian, that they still use in Mythic Plus. That's the only other significant change for the melee DPS. Then we move over to the more depressing side, which is the ranged. We mentioned, again, the Wall of Despair back when we started looking at this, which was the Wall of Night Fae. A grand list of specs going over more towards Night Fae. Actually, technically speaking, even now that you have the choice to just move around, we are actually in an even worse position than before. Because Affliction, Arcane, Balanced Druid are still playing the same covenants they did before. You still have the same options for Beast Mastery, for Demo, for Destruction, Fire Mage as well, same picks. The only slight differences we were seeing back then was the fact that Elemental was stronger as a Night Fae Mythic Plus and as a Necrolord in Red Encounters, more or less. So the change has been decent but not incredible for Elemental. The major change was for Frost. Frost Mage, who had the clear split of Mythic Plus Night Fae for cooldown reduction and for the 70th time because of Night Fae Soulbinds in Mythic Plus, as well as single target Mirrors of Torment Ventir for Red Encounters. So, because generally speaking the majority of the player base is going to choose the best covenant for raiding as the first pick and then Mythic Plus as an afterthought, what we saw since the start of the patch was that the 55% of Night Fae that were speccing for Mythic Plus became 89% right now. So the significant growth in the Mythic Plus pick for Frost Mages for Night Fae, which is bad because now it's even more range DPS playing Night Fae. At the very least, we have a slight victory with Marksmanship. Marksmanship was playing Night Fae. In general, it was still pretty split, but now we have more Marksmanship Hunters playing Kyrian in Mythic Plus. So at the very least, we got a tiny little trade, a tiny little loss for Night Fae over the last 3 weeks. Still, however, vastly the more popular choice for range DPS specs, which is a pretty big contrast, as I pointed out, to the more ample variety of options of the melee DPS specs. Now, what we can go over as the last part of the video is clearing up a few misconceptions, if you will, a PSA to players, giving some more context and some more explanations to things you might see when you try to, educate yourself, try to understand more about your class or your spec, and you try to look up raids and logs and numbers or whatnot. One thing worth explaining to everyone is what happens when you look at this. What happens when you understand that healers now also have a pretty important job in doing damage, that sometimes both in Mythic Plus and raids some healers get more value because they can dish out more damage that can become crucial in certain parts of an encounter or a Mythic Plus pool. And then you go and try to educate yourself on this and you see this image right here. what exactly is going on with Restoration Shaman. I understand why Holy Paladin is at the top. I have also been told that Mistweaver monks have this type of weird fist weaving style and that Discipline priests do damage to heal, so I kind of see them being at the top. And I've also heard the complaints of Holy Priests or Resto Druids not having too much damage, so I can kind of see what's happening there as well. What I don't get is this completely wild gap that Restoration Shamans can have in their damage. Why, when I look at the logs for a boss, I can even see damage looking like this, with Restoration Shamans even topping Holy Paladins in AoE fights and still being present, at the very least the only other spec that isn't Holy Paladin, in single target fights. Well, the reason why this happens is something we have told multiple times before, if you kept notes during the lessons, was the fact that Restoration Shaman does have good damage. Unfortunately, to do so they have to trade healing. Unlike Holy Paladin, who can do damage while healing, unlike Mistweaver and Discipline that can also do damage while healing, Restoration Shaman kind of has to stop to do damage. Because Lava Burst, because Chain Lightning or Lightning Bolt require you to just stop healing. There has been a great buff to Restoration Shaman thanks to Raging Vesper Vortex as well as Vesper Totem in general, allowing you to just pulse healing and damage while you are weaving your damage abilities in a Mythic Plus pack, for example, so that is helping them a lot, but in general, as a spec, they still have to stop healing, which is why, when you look at a log, and you see a Shaman doing super high damage, then you go and look at the healing, and this is the result. That is what allows Shamans to be so high, the top end of Shamans to be so high in damage, because they simply don't heal. The average top log of a DPS Shaman is going to look something like this. They cast a couple of Healing Tides, they cast a couple dozen of Riptides, a handful of Earthen Wall Totems, and the rest is going to be spent on doing damage. Can you tell which one of these two Shamans actually got a top DPS log? I wonder which one of the two. And the reason why you saw, of course, such a big difference between the rankings in AoE fights like Soul Render or even Kel'Thuzad, where Restoration Shamans show up very high, and logs where Shamans are much more scarce, is because they have Vesper Totem and the Covenant Legendary, which can do tons of AoE. So, in fights where there is tons of AoE, there are Shamans that can snipe some top DPS for AoE with their Covenant ability and Legendary, whereas for a single target fight, they can't really cheese it like that. So that is the first PSA for the end of the video. The reason why you can see such wild differences in damage when it comes to healers. The other PSA is what happens here, on the other hand. I have been told that the best healers in the raid are Shaman and Paladin. Why are they the most popular? Why are they the most played? If I look at this graph, and Mistweaver Monk is just slapping everyone down when it comes to healing in raid encounters. If you don't care for the long explanation, then just take the TLDR. The TLDR is this. It's a very nice, concise, rectangle-shaped TLDR. It's this thing that allows them to do that well. The longer explanation is that Mistweaver Monk, much like Holy Priests and much like Restoration Druids, are HPS types of healers. They don't have very strong cooldowns. They don't have Devotion Aura with Aura Mastery. They don't have Wings and Ashen Hallow. They don't have Spirit Link together with Healing Tide. They don't have things like Barrier or Spirit Shell. So they just heal by healing a lot, very simply. The reason why Monk can do so well when it comes to this type of style, because you might ask, okay, sure, but why can they do this so much better than the rest, and why monks specifically? The reason why is that many healers are going to be gated by cooldowns. They are going to be able to heal quite a lot if they can. However, it's going to take some cooldowns, it's going to take some time to refresh or to come back from what they could use. However, they are still going to be gated by cooldowns. For example, there is no point in giving Innervate to a Holy Paladin. Why? Because Holy Paladin is still going to be gated by the charges of Crusader Strike. It's still going to be gated by the amounts of Holy Power they generate. Sure. A couple of times in the fights, if they are using Holy Avenger, they can use Innervate in that specific situation. It's going to save them a lot of mana, but beyond that, they're still going to be gated by cooldowns. Then you have Restoration Shamans. Restoration Shamans are gated by the cooldown of Wellspring, the cooldown of Healing Rain, the cooldown of Riptide, the cooldown of Cloudburst Totem. Basically, everything has a cooldown. The same can be said for Discipline Priests. Discipline Priests are all around their big ramp, which is also where, when you're playing seriously, when you're trying to progress on a fight, that's who you give, for example, Innervate to. But when you're talking talking about a farm boss, when you're talking about you having much more gear, the boss is being nerfed, and being able to start some, some padding strategies like cutting down the healers to allow the remaining healers to heal more. One of the specs that doesn't really have any cooldown that is going to gate them from spamming their heals and constantly healing is Mystiver Monk. So Innervate is what is going to benefit them the most. And for sure, this is mostly just gaming the logs. When you look at the top heals of a healer, you will very easily see something like this, where all of that is just a bunch of innervates. And also, when you try to go and look at the actual healing composition to wonder what happened there, you will almost always see something like this. So basically, 2 healing, soul render, 2.5 healing, because that Discipline Priest is having a stroke mid-fight. That's how you get such a high healing percentage. You get 5 innervates and you are one of the 2 healers in the fight. That is something that Mystiver Monks can do very well. If you did that, if you tried to do that with a Holy Paladin, it would work much worse. That is why you can also see currently Mystiver Monks performing so well if you just check the healing done. They are TLDR, first of all the better spec overall for HPS at the moment because of the very powerful setup with Fallen Order, and on top of that they can use and abuse Innervate the best. If you gave, for example, Innervate constantly to a Restoration Shaman, the only thing he would be able to spam is Healing Surge or maybe Chain Heal. That's it. It's not nearly as effective. And that was our second PSA for this video. Why do we sometimes see Restoration Shaman showing up as doing so much damage in the raid? And then why do we currently see Mystiver Monks doing so much healing in the raid? So I hope that now, after these 2 PSAs, you will come out of this more knowledgeable about the situation. I don't know why it came up to have 2 PSAs about healers. It's just the first 2 things that popped my mind that were, quickly misjudged and quickly misinterpreted when it comes to raiding. So I thought it was good to straighten these things out. For the moment, however, we can end our Friday video here. Very likely tomorrow is when you're gonna get the range DPS video and their power of double legendary use. But for the time being, we can stop here. As usual, thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to continue supporting the channel, or if you decide you want to start now, you can still drop a like on the video, you can comment down below as well. Also, as a last final act of your stay on this browser page, you can subscribe to the channel. And see you guys soon, and in the meantime, I am an idiot. I said I was craving eggs for some reason, and then I cooked eggs in an omelette, and I didn't want to eat it. What's wrong with my brain?